today, because Christine Sinclair retired from club football after she retired from international football last year. Last week, we didn't talk about it on Monday's show. So I thought today we could talk about the fact that is her international goal scoring record of 190 goals, one that will never be broken. So, I mean, I was looking up, because you hear the expression records are made to be broken, right? And I was looking like, what are sports records that no one is ever going to touch, either because the game has evolved, because of the international match calendar, like it applies to soccer. But I mean, you could argue there's the same sort of structure or landscape in other sports where it's just changed entirely. So you've got Wayne Gretzky's assist record is one that came up, Emmitt Smith's rushing yards record, Boston Celtics, 8 straight NBA titles. So Jimmy, I'll start with you. Do you think that Sinclair, 331 appearances or caps for Canada, a 24-year career for the national team, but 190 goals. Do you think that will ever be touched?
It will never be touched again. Never. It'd be impossible. And it's the reason being is because now with the women's professional football around the world, the domestic leagues that everybody's playing in, your international matches are going to be limited. So you're not going to play 300 something on international games, and you got no chance of scoring 190 goals throughout your career now, because now with the women's football, it's following international dates. There's only going to be a few games a year, maybe friendlies, and then plus tournaments. So it's going to be very, very difficult. In fact, impossible to break that record.
I think also you look at the youth, like the conversation around Christine Sinclair throughout her career was, if it's not Sinclair, where are the goals going to come from? And then when her retirement was imminent, it was who's going to take over that role as the goal scorer for the women's national team. So you have a couple of players who have stepped up to the plate. You have Adriana Leon, you have Evelyn Vienne, who looks like she's going to be able to translate the club scoring that she did in Kristianstad in Sweden, and then now at Roma. Doing really well. Looks like she'll be able to translate that to the national team and to the international scene. But she's older, right? She's, I think, 27 years old. And you look at Christine Sinclair, I mentioned it before, 24-year career with the national team. She started when she was 16 years old. So if you take all those factors into consideration, your point, Jimmy, which is a great one, which we're going to dive into in a second, just the way that the game's evolved and changed, and it's grown exponentially. It's way more professional. You have a match calendar where they're taking into account player welfare, but the club setup is so much more the focus of a women's footballer these days. I think it only leaves you with one person, especially on the Canadian side, and that's Annabelle Chukwu, who is a prolific scorer at the youth level, at the U17 World Cup, has done really well at the U20 World Cup. I don't know if she got the golden boot, but she was near the top scorers. She's the only one who could potentially fill in there. And then if you look kind of worldwide at the active list for players in the international game, or actually, if you just look at the top 5, there's only one player, Maisa Jabara from Jordan, who has 137 goals and 133 appearances, who would potentially come close. And then on the men's side, and maybe Jimmy, you can speak to this, will Cristiano Ronaldo ever retire? Is his grasp on that men's national team for Portugal? Does he have that program and the head coach kind of by the throat, where they're sort of, at his mercy in terms of his legacy, and he needs to retire really to make space for other people, but I don't think he ever will. So I think it goes back to the fact, like, 190 will never be touched.
Yeah, I agree. I can't see it happening. 190 goals, especially for Canadian or American or North American players. Maybe elsewhere in the world that they don't have a women's pro league that are just focusing on international games. But then again, they need competition. So you're playing against other countries that probably have these domestic league where you're not going to get as many games as you like. And even if you look at it, Christine Sinclair, 24 years, even if she had 10 matches a year international games, which you never really do. I mean, even that's only 240 games. So she's played an awful lot of games for her country. And score 190 goals is remarkable. It really is. But it would be so difficult for someone to break that record, almost impossible, like I said before. And then as for Cristiano Ronaldo, that's a tough one on its own, because he's such a legend. He's a player that just, he looks after his body, his physique, his fitness levels are just bang on for the age that he's at now. And I mean, what manager or is the federation going to say, sorry, Cristiano, you're not playing today? And but he's still producing, he's still scoring goals, so you have to play him. And although, yeah, those next strikers that are underneath him that are dying for that opportunity, maybe there is a point when Cristiano Ronaldo is kind of looks at himself and says, maybe it's time that I sit in the bench, or I step aside and let that next generation come up. But then, is he selfish? Maybe. So he's probably not going to let that next guy come in because he wants the glory.
Well, especially if you're still arguably top 15 in your country, right?
Yeah.
And you're still, that's just for starting. But how many? Is it 24 players are now allowed to go to World Cup
on a roster?
Yeah,
it's 23.
23. So as long as you're in that top 23, you still have an argument. If you're still potting goals left and right, like he is in Saudi Arabia, or at least kicking them somewhere.
He's scoring international goals.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. But the thing is, even making the team and playing, 20% of 30% of the game, he was not great. We all saw he did not look great this summer with the Euro.
And he takes up so much space. We talked about that in a broadcast at the Women's World Cup in 2023 about Bev Priestman and her rationale and the way that she structured her roster.
I was going to go back to that, and about Rian saying, because it was about Rian saying, she's going. It was basically that old line, go with your, what is it? Leave with your date. Like when you go to an event, these are the people I forget what the line is. I'm not great at that. But I remember Rian saying she has to go and create a lineup and stay structured with it. And it was around Christine Sinclair still. So I guess Christine Sinclair retiring from the national team and having that big go away in Vancouver, and then now retiring professionally, she's making space. But she was the one who did it. And I think, to Jimmy's point with Cristiano Ronaldo, he has a huge ego, and he can still make the claim, hey, I'm a top 20 Portuguese player. And his fans, and some could be fans who are just loud, or some could be fans within the federation. We're going to go, oh, we have to bring them, right? Kind of like what Rian was saying about Christine. She wasn't the player she had been. He was and nothing about it. Was not hey, went out with a lot of skill and fury on the pitch. It was the 2023 for Canada's women's team was a bit of a failure for the World Cup.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fair to say. Yeah, and it was a lot of kind of dominoes that fell, and Bev being too loyal and structuring that roster and that starting 11 around Christine. But I mean, it goes back to, I don't want this talking about Christine Sinclair's record, probably one that's never going to be broken, to be a podcast talking about Cristiano Ronaldo. But I mean, his ego and his legacy, I think, is holding that Portuguese Federation hostage, basically. So I don't think Christine was ever that, but it's about making space for this new generation. And to Jimmy's earlier point, and that's what I wanted to shift to, the women's game, yes, it's grown exponentially, way more professional. So that club setup's taking up more space. But you even saw recently, yesterday, Alexandra Popp, Germany's captain, retired from international football at age 33. She will still go on, I imagine, to play a few more years at least at her club, but her international career spanned 14 years. And she's Germany's third all-time top scorer with 67 goals and 144 appearances. So that's pretty impressive as an international career. And Antoine Griezmann just announced his retirement from international football from the French national team. So also 33. The Atletico Madrid player made 137 appearances for his country, scoring 44 goals, helped them win the 2018 World Cup. So I think you're getting to a point now where you're shifting. Like, you're not only is that untouchable 190 as a number, But you're just in a space now in the professional game, whether it's men's or women's, where players aren't going to have careers that are not going to span 24 years, but they're not going to be 15 years either. You're looking at, I think, a decade as being kind of the ceiling on an international career. Do you think that's fair, Jimmy, now that we're at a space where players and the Club World Cup and all of these competitions that we talked about in the last pod, that it's untenable, that player welfare is definitely something that has to be considered now when FIFA are designing these match calendars.
Yeah.
But it's something where for their own health, for their own well-being, they might be taking themselves out of that international play sooner than you would expect.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think with, it's already discussions now where players are saying it's too many games. And more competitions are coming in, and they're changing formats to add more games. And the players are going to get to a point where they're going to have to make a decision. Am I going to focus on the national team? Am I going to focus on my club football? I don't want to lose my position, club football, going to play international football, because then, that's my bread and butter. That's where I'm making my money. And I think if it's too many games and their performances are dropping at the domestic level, then I think there's going to be a massive issue with too many games being played. And I think you're going to see careers a lot shorter at the international level than what it used to be.
Is that every sport? I'm just thinking about a Christine Sinclair at 16, but also, Lamine Yamal. Sorry. Yeah. And then even, basketball players, hockey players are 17 years old. We saw that Lane kid for the Canadians, wreck his knee.
Patrick Laine.
Pardon me?
Your pronunciation is on point today.
What's his name?
Patrick Laine.
Laine.
Yeah.
See how much hockey. It spells Lane, doesn't it? Isn't Laine?
Yeah, Laine.
Right, well, forgive me for Canadian pronunciation. But it's also this level of how the structure of the actual game. Christine Sinclair playing Puerto Rico, Costa Rica, these lower level teams, and potting so many. I mean, Lucas Cavallini had a good run with the Canadian men's national team too, potting all these goals when he's playing Martinique, all this, and didn't translate to the next level. But is strategy on the professionalization for women, all of a sudden they're like, hey, we're not just going to let this attacker stand free and net hang, basically, because the professionalization calls for strategy, planning, all of that. Doesn't that limit goal scorers anyways? Aren't teams saying, hey, I'm not going to let that person beat me. It will be someone else who beats me, and maybe that didn't happen when 15, 20, 25 years ago as often, where they just said, hey, we're going to stop this one player.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because you think about Christine Sinclair and how nascent the women's game was. So the first World Cup was in 1991. Canada's first World Cup was in 1995. My first World Cup was in 1999. And then that was kind of a seminal moment in women's sport, but in women's soccer, when the U.S. packed the Rose Bowl and won the World Cup. I won't talk about the player who took off her shirt, because we talk about her way too much.
No, I'd like to hear some more.
No, thank you. And then Christine Sinclair's first World Cup was in 2003, Canada's best finish at a Women's World Cup. They finished fourth. So you look at the early days of her career, and I talked about Canada beating Puerto Rico 21-0 as part of CONCACAF qualifications for that 1999 World Cup in 1998. You're not getting these lopsided scores anymore. I mean, and I'm jumping now 2 decades to 2023, but the fear was, with the expansion of the Women's World Cup from 24 teams to 32 teams, is you were going to see teams get routed. And you didn't. Overwhelmingly, you saw parity. Overwhelmingly, you saw teams, even though they were kind of new to the world stage, there was a tactical sophistication. They were well coached. They had access to footage, to scouting, so they were prepared for their opponents, even if they hadn't faced them before. So you're not going to be able to. I hesitate to use it because I don't want to take away from Christine's legacy, but to pad your stats with, scoring 8 goals like a Silvana Bertini in that 21-0 match. So that is also a way that the game has evolved, where it's the playing field is level. I think on the men's game and also in the women's game. So you're not going to see these stats and these score lines kind of balloon the way that they did. So that's another reason, I think,
Well,
why you're not going
yeah.
to see 190. Like, no one's ever going to get close.
And that's kind of where I was thinking even more. Yes, the shift away from international club was one thing, but just the product on the field, because even on the, if I'm thinking Canadian men's national team, Morocco at the World Cup was a semifinalist, right? And we played Belgium and we played Croatia, who like literally the 3 of the top teams, and we played them at a level where the only game that wasn't close was that Croatia game, right? And we are a nascent nation of international soccer fans and players, and a federation that is new to all of this. So I see it happening in the same way for a Jamaica, a Nigeria on the women's side, who even Haiti played well within that structure of the Women's World Cup.
Yeah, but it's also changed too now. I think when you look at, because around the world, the leagues are all getting stronger, the men's and women. There's more opportunity for the better players around the world. And now you've got that kind of open door where you can get these players from that have certain backgrounds, like Morocco. A lot of their players were from France or from elsewhere around the world. France, very similar. Jamaica, when they recruit players, they get a lot of players from England. So you're going to find that, especially
like Curacao, right? Are they a good opponent in CONCACAF because they have a lot of Dutch players, correct?
All the Netherlands, yeah.
And so all the teams around the world are starting to take advantage of the heritage of certain individuals to bring them back to play for their country, which means that their countries end up getting stronger and stronger and better, because now their players are playing in top leagues around the world. And it was funny because remember the last World Cup where we were talking about the standard and the parity, and we thought some teams were going to get blown out of the water, and they didn't. But then my little book that I had, when you start going through it,
your sticker book.
I love that book.
But when you start going through it and you start looking at all the countries and where all these players are playing, a lot of them are playing all in the top leagues. It didn't matter what country it was; they were all playing in these top leagues, and that's why the standard was so good, and it was great to see.
Did you end up getting if you collected all of the stickers for all of the teams as part of the World Cup, did you get like the gold sticker at the end? Like you send in your coupons and you got like the World Cup winner sticker?
Yeah, the thing is, you get a couple of stickers at Phillips, but they stopped just towards the end of it. Do you remember you used to get them with those little hockey books? You go to the gas station.
And you might get a glass at the end or something, a mug.
You'd be yelling at your dad, put more gas in. Come on. Need some more cards.
Well, Tubbs doesn't know this, but that book that Jimmy had from Phillips or FIFA or whoever it was, it actually got stung by a jellyfish and Chandler peed on it. Sorry, Jimmy's going, what's he talking about?
It's just on a bench in Jimmy's washroom is like the bathroom reading material. Just a little bit of pee stains on it.
Yeah.
But I wanted to go back. I was thinking, I think when you were speaking earlier, Jimmy, about Forrest in his early days, and maybe you can talk about your own experience when you were over in England playing professionally, and you would get the call to come and play for Canada. And then you mentioned it there in the women's game, where their players are worried about losing their starting role with their club if they leave and go and play for their country. I think a more organized international match calendar, I think, prevents that. But do you think then in the women's game that you're going to be seeing that it's going to be less about, being pulled away to your countries or like to your national team setup and losing your starting role, but just about prioritizing your player welfare and like what's best for you as a player? And you think, okay, my longevity, you mentioned where my bread's buttered, I'm going to stay at my club, and you're going to see more and more players passing up the opportunity to represent their country, or it's going to be a little bit more strategic from a player perspective?
I think it'll be strategic in a way that if it's a major competition, those individuals will be going to play for their country. For instance, if you're playing in England and you're at an Arsenal or Chelsea and you're playing week in and week out, and there's a friendly that's coming up, and you're thinking, do I go play the friendly, or do I stay here, maybe get another game in, or I'm still training with my team? Is it important for me to go play a friendly? Probably not. Depends where they are in their career. If they've got a number of international games under their belt, and do I want to go play that friendly, or would I rather stay in my club? And I think that's the decisions that you're gonna start to see players eventually make. And depending how many games they've played throughout that season, when you're playing the cup games, and then you're playing the domestic league, and they might be in a Champions Cup or Champions League. So you've got to look at yourself. How many games do you play? Do I want to go get on a flight for 7 hours and go play a friendly against somebody else, and then fly back, and then I'm landing on a Thursday, and then I got a big game on a Saturday? I think players are going to start to really evaluate their situation and see what's best for them, because at the end of the day, as a player, you've got to do what's best for you. You don't want your performances to drop. Yes, it's great put on the international jersey and represent your country. It's a huge honor. But I could start to see players somewhat kind of turning down certain friendlies, but not turning down major tournaments like a World Cup or Euros or whatever it may be. There's no chance.
Yeah, Rian was talking about that as well on the last broadcast, and talking about Northern Super League and scouting and casting a wide net and making sure you are getting all the talent kind of at your disposal, not only in Canada, but kind of mining the areas that make sense. So like looking down, and she was sort of drawing longitudinal lines with her hands and thinking like Uruguay, or thinking South America. And I think that's part of the reason why you've seen an influx of Brazilian players in NWSL. Like there's just been an absolute boom with the amount of Brazilians in NWSL. So I think that's part of it. Like you're taking into consideration. Yes, I think the NWSL has raised their game in terms of their CBA and taking care of players and player salaries. It's an attractive place to play. They've kind of closed the gap, I think, on the WSL. But for a lot of players who are in South America, that just makes sense. It's less travel. It's less kind of demand on your body if you're trying to balance the international game with the professional game. But I wanted to go back, you specifically, Jimmy. I've heard Forrest talk about it a couple of times on the podcast about weighing his options and thinking, do I leave to go and play for Canada? And you've also talked about, it's so rare for a footballer to play to not be carrying a little bit of a knock or a niggle. So was there ever a time where you were maybe carrying something and you thought, this is just not in my best interest? Like I want to go represent Canada, but in terms of my own health, I can't go, or I don't want to go. I want to stay at my club and remain here and try to be what is it, Wonger?
Gonorrhea.
Oh my God.
Oh boy. Sorry, Jimmy. Not you. I'm just, when she said, yes, you. Just fucking
around. What was the question?
Was there ever a time
I think
you didn't go and play with Canada, or that you
always have niggles? I mean, there was a couple of times where I got called up to the national team, and I was playing my club football. I was starting week in and week out, and it was in a good rhythm. I had a couple of little niggles that I did need some rest, and I knew that international break, there was a friendly that was coming up, and I think it was after the Gold Cup, and we had a couple of little friendlies, and I couldn't make it. I think it was against we played Scotland, we played Ireland, and I wanted to desperately play in them, but I knew I wasn't 100%. And I thought, if I go and I play against Scotland and Ireland, and I make this worse, I'm going to lose my starting position at my club level. And I had another left-sided player who was like right on my tail. Right on my tail.
Where was this, Jimmy? What club were you with at that point?
This was at Forest. And he was desperate to get in, and I was holding down the spot, and I was like, there's no way I can't afford to lose this, because if he goes in and he plays well, then I'm sitting on the bench. And then if I went international and I made my injury even worse, I could have been out for a month. And I was like, there's no way I can't do that. And that's why, some games you got to look at your own well-being and make sure that you do take care of yourself, and make sure that you are fit and ready for your club football. Because at the end of the day, that's the important one. Like I said, that's your bread and butter. That's who's paying you. You got to make sure that you're performing and you're holding down that starting position.
This is a spotlight on Jimmy. So Jimmy, I'm wondering if you noticed a difference between players who are European and were playing friendlies or had that international break, basically within the European zone, the continent, and their travel wasn't as crazy as being a North American, maybe having to travel 7, 10, 11 hours to get to the match. Did you notice they came back somewhat more refreshed or less broken down than, or did everyone come back?
It was a lot easier. I mean, look, we played friendlies. I remember we were playing Portugal, Austria, a number of countries in Spain, and it was a quick flight. You know, I remember just getting to the airport, hour, 20 minutes, I'm here, there, wherever it is. And then there was a lot of our internationals. I remember we had a few, like Robert Green, and he was playing for England, and it was Peter Crouch at the time. And, you know, those guys were quick flights and back home. And then I'm flying 10.5 hours trying to get to Mexico. And then where we end up playing, we're playing in Chiapas, which is the southern part of Mexico. And those flights were terrible. And you were exhausted because you play midweek. And then you like I said before, you'd be flying back on the Thursday, the Friday, you kind of walk into training and manager's like, you're good to play. And you're like, you can't say no because you want to play. And you're absolutely exhausted. And you're looking at the other guys that were playing in Europe and they're all fresh, having a laugh. I'm exhausted, bags under my eyes. But that it is what it is. Those are the sacrifices that you have to make. And it's not just me. I mean, we had guys that were playing over in, representing their countries over in Asia. And those were long haul flights that they had to do. And some African players as well doing the exact same thing.
When you were in Mexico, when you were exploring the city and the village where you were playing that game, did you wear your assless chapos?
Yes, I did wear my assless chapos.
Bonnie will be happy about that laugh, Jimmy.
I know Bonnie will be so happy.
Finally, she made me laugh.
Well done, Dubs. Well done.
No,
the delivery.
So listen,
it's actually called Chiapas.
Chapas, okay.
Did you wear your chapas?
Don't chap my ass, Brendan. All right. So I think we've concluded that 190 international goals will never be touched. I think it's safe to say, even if Cristiano Ronaldo manages to play international football until he's 50, please God, no, don't let that happen.